Welcome once again to Questions That Matter, a series where we at TrustBridge discuss the research that we have been conducting. Today, I am joined by my colleague Renuka. Renuka, Upasa, and I wrote a paper called Pump Storage Plants in India, Assessing Policies and Progress, to discuss whether the storage capacity which can come from pump storage is actually being added in infrastructure. Uh, Perhaps Renuka would like to start and explain to us why we decided to pursue this.
We've been thinking about electricity for a while now at TrustBridge, and the renewable energy transition is upon us. Net zero is upon us. And if net zero has to happen, the renewable energy transition has to happen. And the minute you do a lot of RE, you end up with questions of intermittency, right? The sun is not going to be shining at all times. And what do you do at night? When you don't have the sun, or if the wind is not blowing, if wind is a big source of your energy. And that led us to start thinking about storage. Now, there's been a huge development across the world on storage technologies, and I think the world has made enormous progress. And there are many technologies and many ways you can do storage, but the two that seem to have caught on more attention in India than the others are your battery storage and pumped hydro storage. And that's when, we started to kind of say, okay, if PSPs, that's pumped hydro storage, has become so important, then what actually is happening in India on PSPs? And that led us to ask questions around what is the policy evolution of PSPs, and what is the actual implementation of PSPs on the ground. And as you said, that there are some serious RE targets that we've set for ourselves. I think that the Central Electricity Authority that came up with the National Electricity Plan has said that, it would be good to have about almost 27 gigawatt of energy from PSPs. If by, I think, 2030, 31 or 31, 32. If those are our aspirations, then how close are we to getting there? What are the actions that we are taking to get there? I think that's what got us started to, look at this pumped hydro storage space. And I'm going to toss this back at you, Chitrakshi, because what have you seen in terms of the policy evolution on PSPs over the last few years? Because clearly, my sense is that there has been a lot of action.
Yeah. Yeah, so storage technologies are a recent addition to the renewable energy landscape. And so, what we have seen on the policy side is that since 2022, the government has become more aware of the changing and emerging technologies that are coming to this space. In 2022, through the electricity amendment rules, energy storage systems were made a part of the power system. It was clarified that it is a delicensed activity. Particular to pump storage in 2023, the Ministry of Power released guidelines for development of pump storage, which sort of were made keeping in mind how to make the storage component of these plants financially viable. So they offer many incentives to developers in the sense of offering that ISTS charges are waived. So it creates an environment where developers can think of pump storage plants as a viable investment, because as we know, these are large infrastructure projects and they can often be very risky ventures. In parallel, we also have the Central Electricity Authority, which has been trying to come up with measures to expedite the commissioning of these projects. So, the Electricity Authority has been reducing the timelines for granting concurrence. It has been reducing the burden of providing the checklist of documents through various reforms in its guidelines for granting concurrence for these pump storage plants. So, what we have seen is in the past 3 years, the policy environment has certainly become more favorable and more conducive for development of pump storage plants. And perhaps we should also inquire why we decided to actually map whether these policies, which have now become more favorable, are actually leading to any infrastructure development on ground. And maybe you could tell us more about the data set that we created to study whether these policies are actually translating to infrastructure on the ground.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's natural to see, to ask that, if what is the action on the ground. So I completely agree with you that there is certainly a lot of work that the government has put in trying to make PSPs happen. And I mean, it's a challenging project, and we know from India's experience on hydro projects that they actually take a longer time than, let's say, solar projects to take off. So there is that when you start looking at PSP projects. Um, I think it was very useful to have the data set from CMI, which is the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy. They have a data set called CapEx, which lists all the projects that have been commissioned in India, and it has a whole life cycle of from the time of announcement to the time of completion. It tracks the project life cycle. Now, CMI does not always have all the projects because sometimes there is a gap between what the Central Electricity Authority, for example, says on the number of solar projects that have been commissioned versus what we can find in the CMI data set. But very often CMI is able to capture the larger and the more important projects. I mean, in any case, in this particular instance, in the case of PSPs, we got a whole list of projects from the CEA website. And we were able to find almost 90% of them in the CMI CapEx dataset. So I think overall we had about 91 projects that are listed both on the CEA website and on the CMI CapEx dataset. And we were able to extract all the information on these projects. Now, as with data, one has to be very careful about what anything means. For instance, CMI classifies projects as either announced, under implementation, or completed. And then there are, if not any of these three, it could be that the project was shelved either after announcement or after implementation, or it was abandoned, or CMI has not been able to track information for a project for more than 18 months. These things can happen, but the three broad categories really are announced, under implementation, and completion. Now, when we think of announced in English, we kind of think that there is this one big grand announcement and now the project is just going to happen. But what was useful for us to do was to look at uh, how the CEA classifies a project versus how CMI classifies something as announced. I think there is a wider definition used in the CapEx database of what announced means. And whereas many of these projects that CMI classifies as announced are projects which CEA will say that they have just identified. That is, that they think that there is this site and there is potential on this site for a pumped hydro storage project to happen. It does not necessarily mean that a project will happen there. And so the broad stages that the CA would have is project is identified, some survey and inspection has happened, some DPR has been granted, and then there is some construction and some action. So in that sense, the DPR granting is a big milestone in the way CEA looks at the projects, whereas those projects will count as under implementation in CMI, and maybe some projects where the survey is going on will also count as under implementation in CMI. So I think one thing that we were able to do was find the mapping between the CEA definition and the CMI definition, and then use that mapping to more carefully construct the data on what are the projects identified, and from there, what are the projects under implementation, and finally, what are the projects under completion. So I think out of the 91 projects, only 6 have been completed so far, and I think 17 are under implementation. So that says that the CEA has identified many sites, but actually when it comes to under implementation, which is the survey is over and DPR has been granted, we only have about 17 projects. And so when you start then speculating about whether we are going to get to a certain gigawatt, the 27 gigawatt that we hope or we aspire to get, then you have to start thinking about project timelines. That how much time are these 17 projects going to take? What is the electricity that they will generate? And does this add up to 27 gigawatt? And our analysis showed that it could, if we really wrap up these projects in about 6 to 8 years' time. And given the history of the PSP projects, I think that that is a little tight. Okay, not that it can't happen,
Hmm.
but it is a little difficult. Of course, the pushback against this would be that earlier, if you are going by historical timelines, it was largely the public sector that was doing these PSP projects, but it is the private sector that has now shown interest, and many of these under implementation projects are actually private sector projects, and we might see greater completion when the private sector is dealing with these projects. But it remains to be seen. I think the jury is still out on whether we will complete these 17 projects in time to get to our 27 gigawatt aspiration. So we'll see. And, this leads me to kind of wonder what are the roadblocks in India and on hydro or PSPs specifically that takes so long for project completion to happen. And, how do you see those roadblocks and what can be done about them?
Yeah, so hydropower as a technology is associated with more construction risks, and this is not something that is just believed. Even the Standing Committee on Energy has taken note of the fact in 2020 and 2021 that several hydropower projects which were being managed by central public sector undertakings were really lagging behind their cost and time goals that they had set for themselves. So, in the data set that the standing committee published, out of 13 hydropower projects, 12 had significant time and cost overruns. And the reasons that they identified as roadblocks for completion of these projects were often that, given that they are large infrastructure projects, they are ridden with not getting environmental clearances on time. There are issues related to land acquisition, and given that such large tracts of land have to be acquired, the associated litigation on rehabilitation, settlement amounts, etc., often plagues the progress of these projects down. There are contractor related issues, there are local law and order problems. Sometimes the facilities to create this infrastructure are not available in these remote locations. So, there are several roadblocks that can really hamper the time management for these projects, and perhaps these risks that are associated with particular technologies like hydro and also PSPs should be more significantly acknowledged in the policy framework. So, I mean, given that we have this experience of delay in hydropower and what we have seen with the low completion rate of PSPs, what do you think is the direction in which the policy landscape should evolve?
Look, I mean, it's hard. I think the way I see this is for the state to be technology neutral, that it is really for the private sector to choose where it wants to invest. And some of these delays, for example, will be factored in by the private sector when it is putting in money to set up some of these plants. So really, what policy should always do is to be tech neutral and to provide the appropriate enabling conditions so that the private sector can make its own commercial decisions on which direction it needs to go. So to not choose one technology over the other, so not to be biased either for battery or for PSPs, but to just have smooth processes, fair processes, so that predictable processes, which are again issues that we have seen in the Indian state more generally. It's not really related to PSPs in particular, but these are general afflictions of the Indian state, if you may. And I think if we sort some of those out and remain technology neutral, perhaps that's the way forward for us to meet our storage requirements.
Yeah. So, thank you for this conversation. We do promise that we will keep a lookout for storage and other evolving technologies in the RE space, given that it perfectly aligns with our areas of work and our areas of interest, which is tracking the policy developments in the electricity sector. If you found this useful, please like and subscribe our videos, and we hopefully will get you another update soon.